So what I'm going to try to do to just establish what we thought some of the links were between language and resilience and which aspects of language are we talking about. I think we've heard the term language used an awful lot today, which is quite natural, but what parts of language are we referring to when we talk about resilience? So what I'll try to do is sort of unpick the threads of that synthesis and take us back to where we started, which was the data. And the way that I'm going to do that is just to show you a few comments from the people that we spoke to in the field work. So for each principle, I'll give you one illustration. So for the first one, this was quite a common comment. We learn about our language and our homeland in our Arabic literacy classes. We need to know about our identity for when we return home. So you can see why I've chosen that one. It's not so much about laying the foundations of literacy in the first language so that you can then transition to other languages, which is kind of where the research tells us the importance of L1 or first language literacy is. But it's very much related to identity and the kind of belongings that the people that we spoke to described to us. And the other feature of this that I thought was very telling was the fact that it was about returning home. So those trajectories are not one way. This was an Arabic literacy teacher in Turkey who had left Syria. Remember, this was 2 years ago. There's a lot of uncertainty around who will be returning to countries like Syria, when and how and if they will be returning. But clearly there's a role here for that kind of identity formation. And what we found was that people talked a lot about individual identity, but also about collective identities. And the more we kind of probed this type of comment, the more we found that those identities were then related to other identities. But clearly there was a role here for language, and we felt that we needed to establish what that link was. And that was why we chose to connect it to literacy, because there was something going on, not only in classrooms, but also very much on social media. A lot of young men and women, and older men and women, also talked about using social media to stay in touch with people back in Syria, or to stay in touch with people back at home from where they've been displaced. And so we saw that as literacy. You have to have a range of different abilities to read and write if you're going to be able to use your home language to stay in touch with people. Okay, so that was the first one. So you can see, hopefully you can see there, how we brought together home language with literacy, but also with identity. Now, the second part of that was, and several members of the panels throughout today have mentioned it, the link then to schooling and to economic opportunities. And we didn't really think those things were separate. If identity was about having some sense of belonging to a particular community, then that had to be recognized at school. So those kinds of identities had to be affirmed in classroom settings. And then the final dimension of this particular principle related to economic opportunities. So if those early literacies aren't in place, then finding yourself in a position where you can then gain the kind of qualifications that helps you access employment or further training will also sort of jeopardize those opportunities. So there's a lot in that principle, but we saw there was a lot of overlap between the different elements. The second, which was much, I think, clearer in terms of we're talking about language learning programs in languages such as Spanish or English or Arabic or Turkish, if you're a Syrian refugee in Turkey. So almost world languages that have an established set of different materials that you can draw on, different methodologies that we are fully aware of and that we can share with each other. So I'll give you a moment to just look at these comments. They were all from 2 teacher coordinators in a government-run high school in a poor part of Beirut. And they were really struggling. They were exhausted, as many teachers are, they were having to teach the Lebanese students in the morning and then do a double shift in the afternoon when the Syrian students would come in for their classes. They weren't getting paid any more money for doing this, and they had very few resources. So you can see how, under those very difficult circumstances, they feel pretty negative about the learners in the classroom. So this is not to criticize those teacher coordinators. They were amazing people. But you can see how they orient to a very deficit model of understanding the language learning sort of capacities of their Syrian students. So they talk about the culture being different. There was lots of shared cultural norms between the Syrian students who'd moved not very far to be in Lebanon, but the teachers felt there was a difference in culture there. They speak a different variety of Arabic, and this was another one of the reasons for choosing this particular set of comments, because it's not always about languages that are not mutually intelligible. They can be mutually intelligible, but language becomes a symbol of something else. Language becomes a symbol of difference. And in these comments, you can see how that frustration comes out through the way that these young learners are positioned. They felt that English teachers suffered the most because the textbooks weren't appropriate. But then at the bottom, a teacher in the same school, and I observed quite a lot of the classes in this school, and we saw a whole range, as you can imagine, a complete range of different feelings towards this massive influx of students. But this teacher at the bottom was very pleased that she discovered that she could use the Syrian varieties of Arabic with her Syrian students and the Lebanese varieties of Arabic with her students from Lebanon. And this allowed her to sort of, again, make the Syrian students feel a little bit more at home. There were other teachers who punished the Syrian students for using a different variety. So again, language becomes a marker for something else. And so the kind of access that we're talking about here clearly isn't as straightforward as it first seemed. Okay, the third one is about cohesion. I've chosen a very short quotation here. And it was actually from the same teacher coordinators from the previous slide, because at the end of this really rather negative interview, where they'd explained and tried to describe all of the frustrations that they were feeling with this massive teaching load, it was towards the end of the interview, they added this, that in the mornings, there are lots of Syrians in our classes. They know our culture because they've been here for 6 years. So there was this kind of real separating out of the recent influx of refugees after the current crisis, and the Syrians who had migrated more as kind of economic migrants 6 years previously. And 6 years is not a long time, it would seem, for people to have some kind of integration gone on here. So even though during the interview it felt rather depressing, when I look back at the data and you see comments like this, you think, well, clearly there's something else going on. And we thought that this was linked to resilience. This was a protective factor in the sense that when host communities and other communities come together to learn, there are opportunities there to learn about each other's culture. The fourth is about the effects of trauma. Now, we started off really talking about language and trauma from a different perspective. We tried to sort of look at the literature, which is within sort of psychotherapy, and looking at how psychotherapists understand how sometimes a second language can be used to talk in therapy about feelings and emotions that in a more familiar language would have been traumatic. So there is an existing literature here which told us that sometimes a second language, such as English in this context in the Middle East, English might be a way of building that kind of psychosocial support, but also for allowing people to talk about things that they may not be they may find more upsetting in a more familiar language. I think this is quite a controversial way of tackling this particular one, but we had to tackle it simply because teachers were often at the front line of this kind of this situation where they're having to deal with all sorts of different types of adversity in the classroom setting. So one of the ways was the role that language can enhance resilience if it's a second language and it's in a sort of therapy kind of setting. And then there's this more specific role, which was where an actual intervention, a language learning program, can be a setting for psychosocial activities. Now, we're continuing to do some work. I'll talk about that just at the end. But we are continuing to look at future research that we need to carry out in order to find out more about how these principles work in practice, or how we can build on what people are doing practically to sort of make these principles work for particular language planners or for particular providers. And what we're trying to focus on is, what is the relationship between this psychosocial support and learning a new language? Again, I say it's controversial because there are very conflicting views on this. I'll give my email addresses on the end, so it would be interesting if you had any further questions or comments about any of the particular principles, then it would be great if you got in touch and told us if you were familiar with this kind of work. And the example that I wanted to show here is, rather than a quotation, it was from one of the Mercy Corps Kurdistan region of Iraq, adolescent, I think they're called adolescent-friendly spaces or safe spaces, where what you can see here is a drawing by a young man. The people on the left are ISIS. They are the bad guys. And they're using the flag of the Kurdish flag. Oh, sorry, the people on the left are the Peshmerga forces. They're the good guys. And there's this sort of symbolic use of the book and the page of the book, which is being used to crush ISIS, the bad guys. Now, it's a very sort of simplistic. You could read all sorts of different things into this. But what we saw was, in these language learning settings, different languages were being used. You've got the transliteration of the word book in Arabic. You've got some Arabic up on the top on the right, and you've also got a very sort of symbolic kind of use of the image of the book. But these were the kinds of activities, and these are the kinds of drawings that we saw in many of the classrooms. Okay, and the final principle is related to the strengthening of educational systems to create inclusive classrooms, and trying to identify a role for teacher education and teacher development. So this rather complicated quote probably wasn't the easiest quote to get a grip of here now, but this wasn't a language specialist. This whole interview amazed me because it wasn't a language professional. She wasn't a teacher. She was a health professional who was now working as a project manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council. But if you just take a moment to look, and you can see how she's familiarized with the linguistic context. And I think there's a huge amount that the state sector and the government sector, which is the sector that I've often worked on teacher education programs with, can learn from the NGO sector. There's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of knowledge, not just about how languages are used, but also how communities as diverse as this one, how they sort of operate together in a classroom setting. So she'd really got to the bottom of how these different varieties of Kurdish, which are all deeply politicized in that region, given the history of Iraq. But she'd really got to the bottom of how you provide a curriculum for these different ethnic groups, and how important language was.